And I'll briefly introduce you to the room. Although basically everybody, I think, is familiar with Peter Gärdenfors. He's a professor emeritus of cognitive science at Lund University. And he has, and if I would kind of, continue listing all his honors and awards and memberships, then he wouldn't have any time for his presentation, because there's like a lot of them, including things like that from 2011 to 2017, he was part of the Nobel Prize Committee for Economics. And he's a very illustrious research career, which I think started in 1970. So since 1970, he has published about 400 papers in journals and edited volumes, including journals like Science. And he also co-edited or edited 13 books and also wrote a couple of them. So very illustrious research career, spanning also lots of different topics. So his main research areas are concept formation and semantics, as well as the application in robotics. But he also works on the evolution of thinking and language, and the evolution of cognition in general. And that is what he will be talking about today. So let's give a warm welcome to Peter Gärdenfors, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. That took too much time for my talk, but that's okay. I'm normally at Lund, but currently I'm at do you see my cursor, by the way, now, if I do that like that?
Yes, we do.
Okay, yeah. So I'm at Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies. That means in South Africa at the moment, and I'm writing on the evolution of causal thinking together with an archaeologist here. So I'm really into the topic at the moment. But I came to pantomime from a different road, and so the question is, like for all of us, how do we get from animal signaling to human language? And like most of us, I believe that the transition went in several steps. But the special take I have on this is that to look at the role of teaching for the evolution of language, and that will be my focus today, and in particular the role of pantomime in teaching. So I will say a little bit about the intermediary steps. But in my earlier stay here in South Africa, I worked with Anders Högberg, another archaeologist, and we developed a theory of the evolution of teaching. And teaching for us is not a unitary phenomenon, but it involves several kinds of teaching. And we order them according to this table here. So there is non-intentional teaching, which you find in animals and in some humans. And one is facilitation, when you make it easier for somebody to learn without actually getting involved in the teaching, like a cat mother bringing home a half-dead mouse, and the kittens can practice on that mouse. There is also feedback. You can disapprove or approve of a particular action by the learner. Then there is intentional teaching, and again you have feedback, but this time you really want you have the intention that the learner is picking up what you're showing, doing. There is drawing attention, which you can do in different ways, pointing, for instance. And then we get to demonstration, and I include pantomime here. And that's a crucial step, because according to our minds, we find this kind of teaching in non-human animals, but it's only from demonstration and on that we find it in hominids, and maybe there are a few cases of demonstration of pantomime for teaching in animals, but it's not very widespread as far as we have been able to find. Then if you go further up the ladder or down in my list here, next step is communicating concepts. And I'm not saying that we are speaking, but we are somehow communicating concepts here via gestures or via something else. And then fifth level, explaining relationships between concepts, which is more complicated. And then finally, narration. So I'll get back to this list in a minute. But when you look at different communicative systems, I apply a number of criteria, and Jordan will recognize this because my list here is based on something we worked on some 15 years ago. So one criterion is that the communicative act is realized by bodily motion that is voluntary. You have the motions represent something. I will talk about this a little bit later. And a very central condition is this condition of communicative sign function, that the agent, the communicator, intends the act to stand for something, action, object, or event for the addressee. And then for that, the addressee realizes that the act is a representation. It's not a real act, but it's something that stands for something else. So that's a crucial step for a communicative system. Then detachment, this is what Hockett calls displacement, but I call it detachment. We communicate about things that are not present in time or space. I will not say so much about compositionality, so I skip that. I will talk a little bit at the end about conventionality, how we get from non-conventional signs to conventional ones. And I will not say anything about grammaticality, but that's a last step in the list here. So going back to this list of teaching forms, I can analyze we have analyzed in this paper the intention of the teacher. I mean, if it's not intentional, there is none. If it's feedback, that is for correcting behavior, drawing attention, you need to have a joint intention of the learner, and then the intention for demonstrating, and pantomime is to learn the action sequence. I will come back to this. When you communicate concept, you want the learner to perceive a pattern, and then explaining concepts, relationships, you want them to understand a factual or causal relation. Typically that a plant is edible or that animal is dangerous or something like that. And narrating is you want to learn others to learn from your own experiences. Then we've also analyzed the theory of mind, or the mind reading that's involved in the different steps here. And you see that joint attention comes up. Here we have the joint intention that the learner is picking up something from the demonstration or the pantomime. And then you get into, there is some form of understanding sign function here, but I'll get back to that. And then you have the communicative requirements here. And I will focus on this level. This is, of course, the focus for my talk here. But I will say a little bit about these levels as well. So bear with me, and I'll try to explain some of these elements in this big table. Now, Anders Högberg and I, we analyzed these different levels in terms of different kinds of stone napping techniques. And the simplest one are the older one tools, where well, they're not really the simplest one, but they're about 2.5 million years old. And Anders argued that for this kind of tool making, you can't learn it by imitation only, but you have need some form of demonstration. And that's related to something that archaeologists call core maintenance. That means that you have to maintain the core so you can continue napping on it. You have to do it in a particular order, and that order or particular places, and that order is not obvious. You don't see it by imitation only. You can't learn it by imitation only. You have to have somebody demonstrating where and how to nap. Of course, you have to practice as well, but that's another story. So for the older one, we claimed that demonstration was already there. Demonstration was necessary. We didn't say that language was necessary, but some form of demonstration. And then if you go further up, you get to the Acheulean technique, and you get to some special case of that's called the Levallois technique. And that technique depends on when you're napping, you're preparing something like it's called a platform, and that means you're making a 90-degree shape here at the end of the core, and you need that in order to make a very precise blow with your hammerstone, so you get this big flake. That's called a Levallois flake. And understanding that you're making this platform is something you can't learn by imitation. You can hardly learn it by demonstration. You have to have somebody in order for you to learn this efficiently, to explain that this is the right shape of the platform. So you need the concept of the platform, and you need to prepare here. It's a process that goes in goals and sub-goals and sub-sub-goals and so on. So you need a sub-goal of platform before you can do the execute this blow that gives you the level of shape. So this is the Acheulean we associated with explaining concepts, and then you need a richer communication system. So that's the background for me to looking at demonstration and pantomime. So we start with demonstration, and here is a couple of cases of demonstration. And this dancing is a little bit odd because here the demonstrator and the learner are doing the same thing at the same time, but the learner, they use a mirror, typically in ballet dancing, is looking at the demonstrator while she is performing the act at the same time. So it's a special case of demonstration, but I still call it a demonstration. And in an earlier paper, I analyzed demonstration in 4 components. Sorry, my voice is breaking here. I don't have any water. So demonstration means that you're actually performing the actions involved in the task, but you make sure that the learner is attending to the series of actions, and the demonstrator's intention is that the learner can perceive the right actions in the correct sequence. And for doing that, the demonstrator exaggerates and slows down some of the actions. You marks the beginning of an end of a particular part of the process and so on, so that the learner can perceive the important features. So that's breaking down some of the properties of what is involved in demonstration. Pantomime is exactly the same with one exception, and that is you don't actually perform the action when you pantomime. You pretend to perform the actions. Sometimes you have the tool if you're demonstrating with a bow, or you're demonstrating with a hammerstone, but sometimes you don't have the tool. You're showing how to do it without having the tool available. So there are these variations as well. Otherwise, pantomime is exactly like the demonstration. But this difference is really, really crucial here, the difference between pantomime and demonstration. And as a consequence, pantomime can be detached. You can pantomime something that you want somebody to do tomorrow and somebody to do with a tool that is not present. So pantomime, I mean, demonstration is always doing something with things that are present in the environment. You're really performing an action. Pantomime, you don't need to perform the full action. So you get an element of detachment there. And it's a form of pretense. And I want to emphasize a little bit the relation between pantomime and pretense. According to Alan Leslie, pantomime involves a double perspective. You see the object as something. I mean, this boy sees this object as a box, but at the same time, he presents that it is a fire engine, and he acts as if it is a fire engine, or pretends that he is the fireman running out to fire and so on. So you have this double perspective, and that's very important. And the same thing in pantomime. You have the double perspective of seeing the action, but you also pretend that you are doing something else, that you're doing a real action. So there is a correspondence here. And actually, I think, I mean, I haven't really worked this out, but I think that pretense is somehow very closely related to this communicative sign function. I mean, if you can't pretend, you can't engage in a communicative sign function relation. So for me, this relation between pretense and pantomime is quite important. Now, I have made a distinction, and Michael alluded to it yesterday, between two functions of pantomime. One is the teaching function, and this is what I've been talking about so far. And then the action is in kind of invitation or an instruction, if you like, to copy the action. And you want it, and it fulfills the communicative sign function. Demonstration need not fulfill it. but it's a borderline case. And then the learner rehearses. You're showing how to nap a levallois flake or to how to make a béarnaise sauce or whatever. And then the learner is practicing to do the same thing. And the teacher looks at what the learner is doing. And then you get an approval or a disapproval of the learner's action. And then you go back and maybe the teacher demonstrates once again and the learner repeats once again. So this is the teaching situation. Then what most people talk about, and I think most people at this conference talks about pantomime as a part of a message where you're communicating something. And I will get back to what's involved in that. You're telling something as part of a story. So this is my main distinction that I want to focus on in this talk, the distinction between the teaching function of pantomime and the communicative function of pantomime. And I want to argue that cognitively and probably evolutionarily, the teaching function is primary. So I want to give some arguments for this. So here comes an ugly, before I say that, I should say, you can compare between imperative and declarative pointing. Imperative pointing, you want to achieve something with your pointing. You want the other person to bring you something or to attend something. It's an invitation. And declarative pointing you do as part of a story, as part of sharing some experience or something. And the same thing, the communicative pantomime is more like the declarative pointing situation. So I think there is a bit of a parallel between the two functions of pantomime and the two functions of pointing. Now, here comes a table that I will spend some time on explaining, because what I've done here is to contrast demonstration with pantomime for teaching and pantomime for communication. And I've used 6 different criteria. And I could add maybe some other criteria from what we talked about here at the conference. We can talk about conventionality as something further criteria, but I didn't have that on in my table here. So where's my cursor? Okay, communicative sign function. Yeah, maybe you can argue that demonstration has this property, but it's clear in pantomime for teaching, it's clear in pantomime for communication. So I don't want to say more about that. Detachment. No, in demonstration, you're really performing an action. In pantomime for teaching, there is some detachment because you are performing an action and you want the teacher to copy your action. So there is a little bit, you're representing an action that you want the learner to copy a few seconds later. But if you have pantomime for communication, if you're using pantomime to tell a story or to plan something, then there is all kinds of detachment. You can tell stories about things that happened a long time ago and at different places, and you can also have represent somebody else doing something. So there is a lot of detachment in pantomime for communication. The pragmatic form is that, just like with imperative and declarative pointing, demonstration and pantomime is not really imperative, but it's an invitation or an instruction to the learner to involve in demonstration or the pantomime. While in pantomime for communication, the pragmatic form is declarative. You're telling something, you're saying something about the world or planning something for the future. It's not an imperative. The represented action is the demonstrator showing the learner's action, and in pantomime for teaching is the mimer representing the learner's action, not showing it, but giving a representation of it. While in pantomime for communication, you can represent your own actions, you can represent the actions of others, you can represent objects and other things. So that's a more varied situation or in pantomime for communication. And the perspective. Egocentric, focusing on your own actions as a teacher, you're focusing on your own actions, while again in pantomime for communication, you can describe the actions of others from the outside perspective. Yeah, it's not the egocentric perspective anymore. And pretense. In demonstration, there is no pretense. In pantomime, it's limited. In pantomime for communication, you're pretending all kinds of stuff. So this is a brief description of the criteria I use to argue for that pantomime for teaching is cognitively simpler than pantomime for communication. And demonstration is even simpler because it involves even less components. So for each of these components, it's less mental effort for the pantomimer than in this situation. So cognitively, it's simpler to have pantomime for teaching and than pantomime for communication. And I think that's an argument for saying that pantomime for teaching is an evolutionarily older form. I mean, I can't prove it, but I think that's an argument for saying that first came pantomime for teaching, and then that was accepted for pantomime for communication. So this is the core of my distinction between pantomime for teaching and pantomime for communication. Now I go on and compare. Well, I should say that I use pantomime mainly to represent actions. Some people use pantomime to represent long sequences of gestures involving gestures for objects and other things. But my use of the term pantomime is for representing actions. So when I talk about other actions, we can talk about pointing gestures. They indicate location. We can talk about object gestures. Cornelia talked about molding hands or showing shapes and so on. These are gestures that we typically use when we are representing objects. And we can also see how the size and so on. In this movie that Slavik and Brusmek shown with the boy, the man who mimed woman slapping man. You showed the shape. There was an icon for the shape of the shape of the woman's dress and so on. These are typical object gestures, and I reserve the term pantomime for illustrating the actions cases. So you can think of then having these three different types of pantomime as a precursor to language. So as I've already tried to say that I think that we first had pantomime for teaching, and then it developed or evolved, if you like, into communicative gestures. And then you have the pantomime combined with object gestures and pointing to form a proto-sign. So for me, the proto-sign is this kind of combination of different kinds of gestures. And you can say that pointing is a kind of proto-demonstrative, object properties map onto proto-nouns, proto-adjectives, and pantomime map onto proto-verbs. Then how they are combined in a big pantomime with all the components, that's a different story, and I don't have a particular theory about that. But I think that we should put more emphasis in distinguishing the different types of gestures and how they then later become different types of word. I mean, that we sort as linguists, we sort into word classes. Let me also say a few words about conventionalization. And that's something that you can compare to what is called ritualization in animal diets. So here are two typical cases of ritualization. This is an infant chimpanzee, I think it is, and they have he looks, or the infant looks at the mother, or stretches his arms up to the mother, and then the mother lifts up the infant. And as they repeat this sequence of actions, it becomes a ritual between between the animals. And this is studied by Rosano and others, the ritualization process in mother-infant diets. And they have all kinds of signals. I mean, there was one infant who had turned 360 degrees, and then the mother understood that now the infant wants to be lifted up, and she performed it. And here is another form of ritualization. This is what's called the A-frame. They are cleaning or grooming each other's armpits, these two chimpanzees. And this ritual of putting their arms together, it looks like an A if you look at it. That's a ritualization that is learned among some diets. And it's actually something that is slightly more common. I mean, in mother-infant, it's really a dyadic sign that is used here, or this dyadic communication. Here, it's a little bit more than dyadic because many individuals in the troop use this kind of A-frame in their grooming. Now, what we see in language, I mean, we heard about conventionalization earlier in these talks, and in Slavic and Persian's talk, for instance. This is a societal thing. It's not only in diets. So this is you can use the same convention in the entire group of individuals. So the communication partners are replaceable. I mean, if this infant goes to another adult chimpanzee and performs this 360 degrees turn, the adult will not pick up the animal because they haven't, this ritualization is not part of their communication. Maybe this A-frame is exchangeable. The communication partners are replaceable there, but to a limited degree. While if we look at children learning a language, they followed what Eve Clark has called the conventionalization principle. They assume that everybody in their community will use a word or a sign in the same way. So they pick up a word, they pick up a sign if they're using a sign language, and then they presume that everybody around them will use the sign in the same way. I think this is a very interesting step, that we have somehow internalized that. I don't know if it's genetic or how it works, that children make this assumption very early that when a sound or a word or a sign is used, then everybody knows this. And of course, if you've seen children coming to another place where they speak another language, they still think that the other people understand the words they are using, and they're very surprised when they don't. So somehow this principle, conventionalization principle that Eve Clark has presented, is central for the conventionalization of human communication. And I think we should have a little bit more look at how children do this and where it comes from. I don't know very much about, I don't have very much to say about it. But it involves, of course, a higher order theory of mind. I think that the other person will understand what I mean when I'm using this word. I don't really have to go into the Gricean level here, but still it's a second or third order theory of mind that is involved in using a word as a conventionalization. And that's maybe, I mean, the conventionalization principle, presuming a higher order theory of mind, that limits the apes from really having fully conventionalized. I mean, there are cases like this one where it is a convention, but it's not so much dependent on a theory of mind, because it's a very limited collaborative action here, the A-frame. And it also built on joint beliefs, which are also a sign of involving a theory of mind. I believe that you believe that this word means the same thing as I use when I use them, and so on. So these are my comments on how you go from a pantomime to a conventionalized system. So for me, we started with demonstration. That was a teaching function. Then we came to pantomime. And from pantomime, there was an extension from the teaching function to the communicative function. And then there were all, I mean, apes use other forms of gestures. They use object gestures, and they sometimes use, well, not pointing in the wild, but they use grabbing mechanisms for grabbing attention and so on. So you can have a combination. That's the combinatorial part of getting into a more advanced communication system. And then there is conventionalization. I want to say more about it. We've heard from Slavik and Prishmek that this is an important part. And then we also heard this economic aspects in their talks. I don't need to say anything more about that. And then finally, nobody has so far talked about syntax, but for me, the function of syntax is mainly to make communication less ambiguous. So this is my account of the evolution of the different steps in the evolution of language. So I will finish with an ugly picture that I'm sure you will criticize. But anyway, if I put pantomime in the center, it comes from demonstration. And then these two, the origin, the evolutionary origin of their function was that these in demonstration and pantomime were used as parts of teaching. And then they were combined with other gestures, like object gestures and pointing, and that made up something that we could call a prototype. By the way, I don't want to say that prototype and even pantomime is unimodal. It's not only a motor system. I can pantomime the sound of an animal. Onomatopoetic stuff goes into a pantomime as well. Or maybe that's an object, can be thought more of as an object gesture. But what I want to say that prototype was probably not totally unimodal, but there were probably vocal elements into it as well. And then we have proto-language that is becoming more vocal, dominant on the vocal because of efficiency reasons, as we heard in the morning. And then finally we get language. But we also have a connection to ritual. And ritual is an interesting thing here. Man, I think that ritual also evolved out of pantomime, and that has a different function. It's not the communicative function. It has more. I mean, I would connect the role of ritual to the platform of trust that we heard about in the morning. So that the ritual is a mechanism for building up or strengthening a platform of trust. And then Michael mentioned dancing as another way of elaborating on pantomime. And then you can also get into collaborative pantomime. Several people involved in hackathons or in something else. So pantomime was not only the origin of proto-sign, but it can be used for several functions. I mainly talked about this evolution today, but we could also have discussions on how pantomime evolved into ritual and dancing. So with this very speculative graph, I finish my lecture. Thank you very much.
We now have time for questions, comments, and discussion.
And I need to stop sharing because otherwise I can't see or hear you. Here we go. Yeah.
Okay.
I just need to speak louder. Okay, good. So my question would be whether I'm curious in your comments on whether those two perspectives can fit together, and whether this account that you've presented fits with the cost-benefit perspective. So to me, all three phenomena, so demonstration, pantomime for teaching and pantomime for communication, are information donation. So they are in the blue part of the spectrum. And from my perspective, you need a platform of trust for that. And the reason that it's absent or near absent in animals is that they don't have the platform of trust, but they do have, like, what is very, very interesting, you mentioned ontogenetic ritualization of certain communicative behaviors. So this follows the trajectory towards greater efficiency, right? And this needs to be explained. And I was thinking of an explanation that perhaps there are like islands of trust built on a genetic basis. Usually, this is not exclusively, but usually between a mother and offspring, right? And then you have an island of trust that is not sufficient usually to build teaching upon that, which involves a huge investment from the teacher, right? But it's sufficient enough to build like this communicative efficiency, drives for communicative efficiency of signals, which is limited, however, to the island, right? You do not have this community-wide platform of trust. So that's why this kind of catch on for this reason. What do you think about that?
Thank you. That's very interesting. I totally agree that there is no platform of trust in chimpanzees, or very, very limited. You have dyadic trust. You don't have this group trust that we find in hominin societies. So you build up. There is altruistic reciprocal altruism, is it called, when you build up a relation of trust, grooming or food sharing between two individuals. But that's mainly dyadic. Now, teaching is a bit specific. I mean, teaching is very often parent to child and so on. But in all societies, we also see other forms of teaching. And by the way, teaching is necessarily a case of trust. I mean, you don't want to, if you're a teacher, you don't want to fool the learner. I mean, it would be very exceptional cases where you want to teach the learner something wrong. I can imagine cases, but that's not the typical one. So for me, the teaching situation is a good sign of having a platform of trust. You can ask, what is the benefit? I mean, there are obvious benefits for the learner, but what are the benefits for the teacher? Well, very often they are teaching things that are needed for cooperative behavior. You're teaching somebody to hunt, how to hunt something, because you very often hunt in groups. You're teaching somebody how to cook something because you need to collaborate in cooking. You're teaching somebody how to make a fire because you need to collaborate in how to make a fire. So teaching is very often a part of a cooperative enterprise within a group. And by the way, teachers very often gain in status in all society cultures. A teacher has a particular status as being a knowledgeable person. So you get a benefit for the teacher is a raise in status. So I think this teaching perspective fits quite nicely with your platform of trust explanation here, and also maybe you could say something about the efficiency. I mean, I didn't talk about how much more efficient you become when you use concepts to explain, and when you talk about relations between concepts. But that's quite obvious that you become a more efficient teacher if you can convey concepts to your learners.
Thank you very much. As you were explaining that, I realized how true this is in academic studies when you teach your students how to use Elan, how to use Pratt, how to use SPSS, so that they can become better than you and they can help you with the coding and the stats. Thank you.
First, thank you for digging up our old 2005 paper on mimesis as the missing link. It's a pity it never made it to BBS. Otherwise, more people would have known about it. But yes, communicative sign functions. So the question is, I find your distinction between pantomime for teaching and pantomime for kind of detached communication very intuitive, right? As you say, it makes a lot of sense in terms of all the features, and it positions itself there between demonstration and I was wondering whether we could think a way of testing it with children. Maybe Paula would have some ideas, and the reason is like this. But so one reason that I didn't put like a detachment as an extra feature is because I thought that if you have fully fledged communicative science function, you get detachment for free. right? Because I mean, I can, once I can refer with a gesture or with a word, it doesn't matter whether I can refer to Przemek whether he's here or whether he's not here, as long as there's a communicative sign function. But maybe there is this intermediary role in which pantomime is functioning with a communicative sign function, but a little bit more like Piagetian's another analogy than the one you made between deferred imitation and more or less direct imitation, and somehow more cognitively easier to refer to do like this, but not exactly like this. There still is, you know, as if like this, but for real. So would it be any evidence that you or Paul or anybody would know, let's say, of children understanding this kind of pantomime for teaching at an earlier age than the other more detached pantomime?
Thank you. That's a very interesting suggestion. And I would really want that somebody, I mean, not myself, because I know too little about children's pantomime to be able to do it. The only kind of evidence I come to think of is that children, when they pantomime brushing their teeth, they use the object. They pretend that the finger is the toothbrush. It's only when they get a bit older that they can pretend brushing the teeth without showing the object. So somehow they preferred showing the object as part of the pantomime to not having it. I don't know why, but that could be one piece of evidence for how their capacity to pantomime is developing. But you shouldn't ask me about the data here because I'm not too familiar with it. Maybe somebody else in the audience can say more about that.
I mean, Monica Boruta-Dziewiczenska's PhD is a little bit related to that, because most studies in children work on production rather than comprehension. I'm thinking of the kind of comprehension studies that we were working with Sarah Lenninger from her some time ago. So what Monica is doing is showing two different kind of gestures to 2-year-olds and 2.5-year-olds, either the more pantomimic, you know, the enacting type, or the more minimal representing kind, somehow supposing that the first one will be understood before the others. But your distinction is slightly different. You know, I guess in one case, the instruction will be do like this, but it should be in the repertoire of the child to do like this. And the other is, can you understand this and do, you know, pantomime a bird, exactly, right? And have the child recognize the bird pantomime, even though that will be detached. Anyway, thank you. Anyway, maybe Paula or somebody has anything to comment?
I don't have a suggestion for a study. Monica, they're talking about you. But I will be talking about exactly this kind of gesture and this in my talk shortly.
Good.
Want me to? Okay. Yeah, we also have some questions in the chat, and you can read them for yourself. But I'm also going to read them out, and in order of how they were asked. Stephen Brown asks, when it comes to teaching, why engage in pantomime at all? Why not just perform the true action?
Oh, I forgot to say that. Of course, when you're doing, I mean, I gave the example of the level of our flake. If the demonstrator or the teacher is actually performing this napping of the flake, then there is nothing for the learner to do, because then the core is destroyed. You can't do it once again. So in many cases, if you're harpooning a fish, showing how to harpoon the fish, you can't harpoon the fish because then there is nothing for the learner to harpoon afterwards. So in many cases, or if you're showing how to make an omelette and breaking the eggs, you can't break the eggs because then the learner can't break the eggs. So in many cases, performing a demonstration would be destroying the learning opportunity for the learner, and that's one reason. I don't think that's the only reason, but again, I would say there are other. If we use the terminology of efficiency here, I think that very often the pantomime is more efficient than a demonstration.
Then there's a question by Cornelia Müller. Oh, Stephen Brown says thank you. Yeah, there's a question by Cornelia Müller, and she asks, thank you for a very interesting lecture. I have a very small question. It relates to the transition from demonstration to pantomime for teaching to pantomime for communicating. Would you agree that this goes along with a gradual decontextualization of the pantomime?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I use the term detachment. I think that could be replaced more or less with decontextualization. And I mean, it's not only from demonstration to pantomime, but it's from pantomime from teaching to pantomime for communication. So there is a gradual decontextualization in this process. I totally agree.
With one more by Francesco Peretti. And he says, thanks for the talk. I find convincing the idea of teaching as the primary use of pantomime, and that teaching function can be considered a prerequisite for communication. I wonder if the priority of teaching on communication can be interpreted as a way to consider communication in terms of persuasion. One can say, in fact, that as in the case of demonstration teaching, in communication, the addressee must accept what the sender says, in addition to understand what she says.
Thank you. I thought about this question during the talk yesterday, when you used the term persuasion. I prefer to use the term invitation or something like that. I mean, persuasion is a little bit too strong for my taste here when it comes to teaching. I mean, you don't. I mean, if the learner doesn't want to learn, I mean, there is nothing you can do as a teacher. You want to show. I mean, if the learner is interested in learning, then you invite the learner to copy your demonstration or your pantomime. So yeah, you're on the right track, I think, but I think the persuasion is a little bit too strong in this situation.
Are there other questions, comments? While people gather their thoughts, I have a question, and I was thinking about pretense and pretend play, because so kind of based on what you kind of said in your 2017 paper, Schimek and Sławek, and I've been also thinking and working on that a bit, and I was wondering, kind of like, you had this, you know, this model that you showed, basically how do we get to language, and where does pretense and maybe pretend play come into it, and also in terms of the cognitive abilities underlying it, because you said one thing, that like pretense involves some kind of double perspective, and that's of course a very mentalistic, very cognitive understanding of pretense that's quite advanced. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Mow the Troll experiment. That's an experiment by Angeline Lillard, where basically she shows children a troll, Mo, and Mo doesn't know what a kangaroo is, but he hops like a kangaroo and jumps around like a kangaroo. So is Mo pretending to be a kangaroo, although Mo doesn't know what a kangaroo is? And before children reach the age of 5, they say, yes, Mo is pretending. So the fact that like Mo doesn't cognitively represent kind of the pretense, it's not important for children before the age of 5. Before that, they focus on the action outcome. So this idea of double perspective, kind of this mentalistic understanding, seems to be something that's kind of later developing. Before that, it's more action focused.
Okay, do you really have to interpret the experiment in that way? For me, the before 5 years old, they don't have this knowledge about that. Other people don't know the same as you know. I mean, if you know what the kangaroo is, and then you expect that Moo also knows what a kangaroo is. So I think that's more a question of theory of mind than rather understanding what pretense is in this experiment. That's my interpretation. I wasn't aware of this experiment. But anyway, I think pretense is interesting because some apes, I mean, gorillas, chimpanzees can pretend. I mean, if they have grown up with people, and they pretend. I don't know if they pretend in the wild, but when cuckoo pretends a lot, and cancer pretends a lot. So they have learned or somehow understood that you can perform an action, pretending to sleep or whatever, and knowing that you're not really sleeping, and knowing that the one who is looking on knows that you're pretending. That's a fairly advanced form of theory of mind, I would say. And if I'm correct, that ability to pretend could be the first step towards understanding the communicative sign function. So, I would like to investigate, me or together with somebody else, this connection between pretense and understanding communicative sign, the sign functions here. Alan Leslie has in his paper on pretense written a little bit on that, but I don't think I don't remember about how much he writes about the comparison here. I have to go back to that. But anyway, I think that's an avenue that is interesting to follow.
All right, thank you. Next question coming up.
I don't hear.
From
No, I hear. Okay, fine.
Okay now?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that very interesting talk. I'd like to refer to one of the questions from the people with us online today. Somebody mentioned that why not stop at demonstration? Maybe, for example, demonstration is the best way to teach. So why even go to pantomime? Why should pantomime have this teaching function if maybe demonstration is the best teaching? And I'm willing to buy the argument that perhaps it could be because if the teacher demonstrates everything, then the student doesn't have a tool to use. But maybe there could be two eggs, or maybe there could be two rocks to make. I think there could be a case that maybe demonstration could be the best. But what I wanted to ask is, perhaps it could be the other way around, that if demonstration is the best way to convey the information, perhaps pantomime begins with the learner practicing first. So the learner practices the pantomime while the teacher just demonstrates with the object. And so in that way, pantomime is almost communicating to the teacher that I'm kind of doing it right before he does the actual demonstration with the real object. So it'd almost be like reversing the process, that pantomime serves to communicate that, or just a practice function in the teaching dynamic. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, of course, lots of sports people do these kind of body movements without actually performing the action and so on in practice. So that's an interesting idea, that pantomiming from the part of the learner could be one way of using one word for pantomime. When I learned to swim as a kid, I mean, you were practicing on land before you were how to move your body parts, arms and legs, before you were getting into the water and training. So that was a kind of pantomime swimming you did. And that's an idea. But as I said, I agree that demonstration is better as a teaching tool than a pantomime, because you see the objects, you see the action, you see the consequences, and so on. But sometimes it's simply not available. So then you have to. And maybe we could develop this idea of efficiency of pantomime. I mean, economic, it's more economic, and so on. And that would be another reason for pantomime over demonstration.
Yes, thank you.
Right. Oh, we have one final question, maybe.
Peter, why do you wish to restrict pantomime to the representation of actions? Well, I can see it, if you have actions and then you have object gestures and pointing. But look at some of the data that we were showing yesterday, in which we have whole events that are being represented. I agree that the action is at the core of them, but we have also the doer and the patient. and even sequences of events. So why not having pantomime being as a mode of representing events and maybe even narratives, but again, best at actions?
Okay, that's dependent on, I mean, I totally agree that we are representing events. We want to represent events. But according to my understanding of events, the verb, the action is a central part. And then you can embellish the action by showing the subject and the object, the agent and the patient, I should say, and the instrument and the result and so on. So I still think that you need a verb to describe an event. A state, maybe not, but an event. And just a small comment, not answering your question, but to Michael's demonstration yesterday of airplane being a hand, still hand, and flying being a moving hand. This principle of having objects as a stationary hand and verbs as a moving hand seems to be quite common in sign languages, as far as I understand. So you make a distinction between object gestures or object signs and verb signs in that way. I don't know what this sign specialist would say about this interpretation, but I still think that we make a distinction whether we are depicting an action or we are depicting an object in our gestures. We understand that to some extent.
I agree. I think we all agree after this workshop that as we're moving towards the right of the continuum that Przemek and Slavek were showing towards the less pantomimic, we have to have ways to individuate the objects and separate between the plums and the and the cherries and the men and the women and so on. And that if that still is pantomime, that is at least much more conventionalized and structured pantomime. Thank you.
Right, then let's give another applause to our speaker.
Thank you.